Welcome to the Sleepy Scribe. Your endless internet wandering has brought you here, and hopefully you can finally sleep to today's topic. Now, before we begin, comment where you are listening from, and how late it is where you are. It is very interesting to see how far and wide people come to find peace here. Lastly, if you enjoy these videos, please subscribe, it would be very appreciated. Now, let us begin. In the quiet folds of medieval Europe, long before the Black Plague carved its shadow across the land like a dark, creeping fog, life for peasants was a rhythm woven from the soil beneath their feet and the heavens above. Imagine a small village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, where thatched roofs huddled close like old friends sharing secrets against the chill of dawn. The peasants, farmers, craftsmen, and laborious, were the heartbeat of this world, rising with the sun and settling only when twilight draped the sky in hues of purple and gold. Their days were shaped by the seasons as surely as the stars traced their paths across the night. Spring brought the scent of damp earth and the first shoots of green, a promise of life renewed. Summer unfolded in a blaze of sun and sweat, where hands turned soil and reaped grain beneath a sky vast and endless like the ocean. Autumn was a time of gathering, a frantic dance to store food before winter's grasp tightened like a cold hand. Winter, in turn, cloaked the village in silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the whisper of wind through bare branches. The peasants' world was small yet full, bounded by the fields they tilled, the forest's edge where wild berries and game hid, and the village chapel, whose bell told the hours and the seasons, a steady drum in their lives. Their homes were humble, walls of wattle and daub, floors of packed earth, and smoke curling from chimneys that tasted of wood and hearth. Inside, the hearth was the soul of the home, a place where stories were told, meals were shared, and warmth gathered like a soft blanket against the chill. Families were large and tightly knit, a web of relationships that sustained each member through hardship and joy. Children played with simple toys carved from wood, their laughter like bright sparks in the grey of daily toil. Education was scarce, passed in the form of oral traditions, folk tales, and the teachings of the village priest who preached from a small stone church that stood as both spiritual guide and social centre. Yet, despite the hardships of poverty and toil, there was a deep connection to the land and community, a steady pulse of life beating beneath the challenges of existence. Peasants lived under the yoke of the feudal system, a web of obligations and protections that bound them to the lords of the manor. They owed labor, crops, and loyalty, but in return, they received the right to work the land and the promise of safety, though both were often fragile and fraught with tension. Their days were filled with backbreaking labor, ploughing fields with oxen, planting seeds in rows neat as the stitches of a quilt, tending animals whose soft breath warmed the cold mornings. The cycle of planting and harvesting was a sacred rhythm, tied to festivals and rites that marked time as much as the seasons. In these moments, the world felt vast and alive, full of mystery and the quiet magic of growth and decay. Life was harsh, the work relentless, and the rewards often meager. Yet, in the face of hardship, peasants found joy in the small things, a shared meal of coarse bread and cheese, the bloom of wildflowers at the edge of a field, the simple music of a flute played by a wandering minstrel. Their lives were a tapestry woven from sweat and hope, from the earth's embrace and the sky's watchful gaze, a story as old as time itself. The world of a medieval peasant was framed by more than just the land they worked. It was defined by the rhythms of the feudal system, a structure as rigid and unyielding as the stone walls of the lord's manor. At the top stood the noble lords, men and women whose power was like a towering fortress casting long shadows over the fields and villages below. These lords owned the land and held the keys to a peasant's very survival. In exchange for protection, peasants owed their labor, a portion of their crops, and various taxes. The lord's demands could be as heavy as the weight of a storm pressing down on a fragile roof, yet the promise of safety from bandits and the chance to till a small plot of land were often the only options for those born into the peasant class. Life under feudalism was a constant negotiation between obligation and endurance. Peasants worked the lord's domain, the land reserved for the manor's direct use, ploughing, sowing, and harvesting with tools simple yet effective, often made of wood and iron. Their days began before the sun had fully stretched its fingers across the sky, and only ended when twilight's cool fingers slipped through the cracks of their cottages. Beyond the lord's land, peasants cultivated their own strips of soil, called holdings, which provided the food to feed their families. These holdings were small, barely enough to stave off hunger, and they had to be carefully tended to survive the ever-present threats of bad weather, pests, and poor harvests. Seasons dictated the pace of work, plowing in spring, tending crops through summer, harvesting in autumn, and repairing tools and homes in the harsh, quiet months of winter. The village was a tightly knit community where everyone knew each other's struggles and stories. Cooperation was essential. Neighbors shared labor during planting and harvest, helped rebuild after storms, and gathered for festivals that broke the monotony of work with music, dance, and prayer. The church was the heart of the village, its small stone building standing as a beacon of hope and faith. Priests offered not only spiritual guidance but also a connection to a world beyond toil, where prayers for good harvests and protection from disease were woven into daily life like threads of comfort. Despite the hard labor, there were moments of respite. Holidays marked by the Christian calendar, such as Easter and Christmas, brought brief celebrations filled with feasting and storytelling. Yet beneath these moments of joy, life remained precarious, the threat of famine, disease, and the demands of the Lord always looming. Understanding the peasant's existence means grasping this delicate balance between survival and submission, between the earth's harsh realities and the flickers of human resilience that kept families going through the darkest times. Before the shadow of the Black Plague stretched across Europe, the health of peasants was precarious at best, shaped by a fragile understanding of medicine woven with folk beliefs, superstition, and the limited knowledge passed down through generations. In village huts with walls thin enough to let in the whispers of wind, the sick were often cared for by family members or local wise women, herbalists who gathered plants from meadows and forests like secret treasures, brewing poultices and teas in earthenware pots. Remedies were drawn from nature's bounty: willow bark to ease pain, nettles to staunch bleeding, and lavender to calm restless spirits. Yet, these treatments were as much about hope and ritual as about healing. Disease was often seen as a punishment from God or the result of malevolent spirits, and peasants turned to prayers, charms, and rituals to protect themselves and their loved ones. The church held great influence over notions of health, with priests blessing homes and leading processions to ward off plague and pestilence. In these simple villages, the line between the physical and spiritual world was blurred, and illness was a shadow that touched both body and soul. When sickness fell upon a family, fear and helplessness often followed close behind, for the harsh realities of medieval medicine meant that many diseases, from fevers to infections, were little understood and rarely survived. Midwives, who assisted with birth and cared for women, held a vital place in the community, weaving together knowledge of herbs and prayers, standing at the fragile threshold between life and death. Despite the limitations, there was a deep-seated resilience, a stubborn will to endure hardship, to nurture the next generation, and to hold on to the fragile threads of life even when the world seemed poised to unravel. This fragile balance of health and illness set the stage for the coming storm, the Black Plague, which would sweep through these villages like a dark tide, leaving few untouched and shattering the familiar rhythms of peasant life forever. The arrival of the Black Plague was like a sudden, suffocating storm rolling over the horizon, silent at first, then bursting forth with a relentless fury that shook the very foundations of peasant life. For centuries, the villages of medieval Europe had lived by the steady rhythms of the seasons, their days filled with toil, faith, and the small joys found in family and community. But when the plague arrived, it tore through these familiar patterns like a wildfire in a dry forest, consuming everything in its path with terrifying speed and merciless intent. The disease came from far-off lands, riding the backs of fleas that lived on rats, silent passengers on merchant ships, traveling through bustling ports and winding trade routes that connected the world like veins of life. For the peasants, who lived close to the earth and traveled little beyond their fields and forests, the arrival of the plague was bewildering and inexplicable. It was a dark shadow creeping through towns and villages, striking down the strong and the weak alike, leaving behind empty homes and silent fields. Fear spread faster than the disease itself, whispered on the wind and carried in the wide eyes of neighbors who vanished overnight. People spoke in hushed tones of black boils, swollen and weeping, like nightmarish flowers blooming on flesh. The fever that burned like a furnace, the chills that rattled bones, and the coughing that ripped through lungs were signs of an invisible enemy that no one could see or fight. Many peasants turned to the church for answers, gathering in crowded chapels to pray for deliverance, their voices rising in desperate hymns beneath wooden rafters darkened by smoke and sorrow. Yet, even as they sought comfort in faith, suspicion and panic gnawed at the edges of their communities. Some believed the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of mankind, others whispered of witches and heretics spreading poison. In the chaos, scapegoats were hunted, and bonds of trust frayed like old ropes under too much strain. Daily life changed in ways unimaginable. Fields went untilled as farmers fell ill or fled, and the once bustling village square grew eerily quiet. Markets emptied, and the simple pleasures of festivals and fairs were abandoned to the silence of fear. Families were torn apart as loved ones succumbed to the sickness, their deaths swift and merciless, leaving behind grief heavier than any harvest's burden. The plague did not discriminate. Children, elders, and the strongest laborious alike were claimed, their bodies buried in hastily dug mass graves, the earth swallowing their secrets and sorrows. Villagers, once bound by the shared struggle of survival, found themselves isolated and desperate, caught in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Amidst this despair, stories emerged, of those who fled the plague-ravaged towns, carrying their fears and sometimes the disease itself into the countryside. Some sought refuge in remote forests or mountains, clinging to the hope that distance and isolation might offer protection. Others, resigned to fate, cared for the sick with whatever strength remained, their acts of courage shining like small beacons in a darkened world. The Black Plague's arrival shattered the fragile world peasants knew, turning the land of steady seasons and humble joys into a landscape of loss and uncertainty. It was a time when the line between life and death blurred, and the ancient rhythms of farming and faith were drowned beneath a wave of sorrow as deep and cold as winter's grasp. Yet, even in the heart of this storm, the human spirit's flicker of hope and resilience struggled to survive, waiting for the day when the sun would once again rise over fields ready to be sown and villages eager to welcome the laughter of children. In the shadow of the Black Plague's arrival, the daily lives of peasants transformed in ways both immediate and insidious, reshaping the very fabric of their existence. Villages once alive with the hum of activity became places where silence hung heavy like a thick fog settling over empty streets and abandoned homes. The relentless grip of the disease tightened, pulling families apart and turning neighbors into strangers marked by fear and suspicion. The routines that had governed life, plowing fields, tending livestock, baking bread, gathering at church, were shattered as sickness and death swept through with a cruel, unyielding hand. As the plague moved from village to village, peasant communities grappled with the growing terror in their midst. At first, confusion reigned. No one understood what caused the strange boils and fevers that came suddenly, nor how the disease spread so quickly, as if carried on the very air itself. Folk remedies and prayers, once sources of comfort and hope, began to falter in the face of overwhelming loss. Some peasants turned to ancient rituals, lighting candles and burning herbs, hoping to cleanse their homes of evil spirits believed to carry the illness. Others sought the protection of saints, pilgrimage sites, and holy relics, clinging to faith as a shield against the invisible enemy. But as death piled up, first the elderly, then the young, then the strong, the comforting walls of tradition began to crumble. The church, once a sanctuary, struggled under the weight of the crisis. Priests, who normally ministered to the sick and led funerals, often fled in fear or succumbed to the plague themselves. The sacred rites of last confession and burial were sometimes hurried or skipped altogether, leaving souls restless and bodies unclaimed. The loss of spiritual guidance deepened despair, and some peasants turned to superstition and superstition's darker shadows, blaming outsiders, witches, or the wrath of God for their suffering. Communities fractured as fear bred mistrust. Neighbors avoided one another, wary of sharing food or shelter lest they catch the dreaded sickness. Families isolated themselves, locking doors and shuttering windows, watching helplessly as loved ones grew ill behind closed walls. The simple act of tending to the dead became perilous. Many were forced to bury family members themselves, often hastily and without ceremony, in mass graves dug by trembling hands. This work was both a physical and emotional torment, a grim reminder of how deeply the plague had permeated every aspect of life. The economic impact rippled outward, compounding the social and emotional devastation. With so many peasants dead or incapacitated, fields lay fallow, crops went unharvested, and livestock wandered untended. The scarcity of food became a dire threat, turning hunger into a cruel companion alongside disease. Markets closed, trade slowed, and the fragile system of barter and exchange that sustained village life began to crumble. Lords and landlords, desperate to maintain control, sometimes imposed harsher demands on the dwindling peasant population, fueling resentment and hardship. Women and children faced particular challenges in this harsh new world. Widowed mothers struggled to feed and protect their families, often stepping into roles left vacant by fallen husbands and fathers. Children, orphaned or abandoned, faced uncertain futures, their survival dependent on the charity of neighbors or the mercy of distant relatives. In some villages, entire generations were lost, leaving a void that would echo for decades to come. Yet, amid the overwhelming despair, stories of resilience and quiet heroism surfaced like fragile blooms in a scorched field. Some peasants, despite their own fears and losses, cared for the sick and dying with selfless devotion. Others took bold steps to flee infected areas, seeking refuge in remote forests, mountains, or isolated farms. These acts of courage and endurance, though often overshadowed by tragedy, were threads of hope woven into the dark fabric of the plague years. The social order itself began to shift under the pressure of these losses. With so many peasants dead, labor became scarce, and those who survived found themselves in a stronger position to demand better conditions. This shift planted the seeds for future upheavals, as centuries-old feudal bonds began to loosen in the face of a changed world. The Black Plague was more than a disease. It was a force that reshaped peasant life in fundamental ways. It tore through communities with relentless cruelty, upending the rhythms of daily work and faith, and casting a long shadow over the future. Yet, in the midst of this devastation, the human spirit's flicker of hope endured, quietly resisting the darkness as peasants struggled to rebuild their lives on the shattered soil of a world forever changed. The changes wrought by the Black Plague did not end with the immediate horror of sickness and death but unfolded slowly over years, rippling through the social and economic fabric of peasant life like unseen currents beneath a stormy sea. In the aftermath of devastation, survivors found themselves facing a landscape both familiar and profoundly altered, where the old rules and expectations bent and sometimes broke under the weight of loss and scarcity. With a great many peasants claimed by the disease, labor became a precious and rare commodity. Fields that once stretched green and fertile lay fallow, and the quiet absence of voices in the village was a reminder that countless hands were gone, taken by a sickness no one could fight. Those who remained discovered a new kind of power in scarcity. Lords who had long demanded heavy labor and taxes suddenly found their tenants fewer and more valuable, and in some places, peasants began to negotiate for better wages, more freedom, and the right to keep a larger share of their harvest. This shift was a slow-burning ember of change, a crack in the ancient walls of feudal obligation that had for centuries bound peasants to the land and the lord's will. In some regions, this newfound leverage led to unrest. Peasants, weary from loss and emboldened by necessity, challenged the authority of nobles, sparking revolts and uprisings that echoed like distant thunder across the countryside. These moments of resistance were met with brutal force, but they planted seeds of change that would grow in the centuries to come. The economy, too, shifted in unexpected ways. With fewer people to farm the land, agricultural production decreased, leading to food shortages and rising prices. Yet, for those who survived, opportunities arose. Some peasants moved to towns and cities, seeking work as artisans, merchants, or laborers, contributing to the slow growth of urban centers that would reshape medieval society. Others found that they could rent land or even buy their freedom, stepping away from the rigid constraints of the manorial system. The psychological impact of the plague lingered long after the last black boils had healed or faded from memory. Communities grappled with grief and trauma that echoed through generations, shaping beliefs, customs, and even religious practices. The dance of death, or danse macabre, became a common motif in art and literature, a haunting reminder of mortality's inescapable reach. Faith, shaken by the plague's seeming randomness and the church's inability to halt its advance, evolved and splintered, setting the stage for later religious upheavals. Women, whose roles had expanded during the crisis, found new spaces of influence and responsibility. Widows managed farms and households, while some took part in healing and midwifery, roles that combined traditional knowledge with the desperate needs of a society in flux. Children who survived were often raised in changed family structures, sometimes cared for by relatives or absorbed into new communities as orphans. The memory of the Black Plague settled into the soil of peasant life like a deep scar, a chapter of suffering and survival etched into the collective consciousness. It was a force that broke the old world open, creating cracks where new possibilities and new struggles would emerge. Through loss and hardship, peasants began to forge a future that, while shadowed by tragedy, carried the seeds of transformation and resilience beneath its surface. The daily routines of peasants before, during, and after the Black Plague reveal a story of endurance in the face of upheaval, a world where survival depended on hard labor, community ties, and the fragile rhythms of nature. In the years before the plague, peasant life was governed by the relentless cycle of the seasons. From dawn to dusk, the fields demanded attention: plowing, sowing, tending crops, and harvesting. Oxen yoked to wooden plows tore through the earth, turning it over like a giant's hand preparing a canvas. Hands, calloused and strong, planted seeds with care born of generations, each kernel a promise of food and life. Villagers labored together during planting and harvest, their efforts a chorus of sweat and song, a shared struggle against the uncertainties of weather and pests. The village was alive with the hum of daily tasks: women grinding grain at stone mills, children chasing each other between cottages, blacksmiths hammering iron sparks into tools. The church bell marked the hours, calling people to prayer and reminding them of the divine order that held their world in place. But when the Black Plague swept through, these rhythms fractured. The fields went untended as the able-bodied fell ill or fled. Crops rotted in the soil, livestock wandered without care, and granaries emptied as hunger gnawed at the edges of fear. Those who remained faced an impossible choice: tend the land or care for the sick, knowing both tasks were likely to lead to exhaustion or death. The social fabric of the village, once a tightly woven net of cooperation and mutual support, began to unravel. Neighbors no longer gathered for feasts or festivals. The laughter of children grew quieter, replaced by the sobs of mourning and whispered prayers for mercy. Yet even amid this despair, acts of courage and kindness flickered like candlelight in a storm. Some peasants, driven by love or duty, cared for the dying despite the risks, their hands gentle even as their hearts broke. Others formed small groups to share what little food remained, protecting each other from hunger and isolation. As the plague receded, the survivors returned to the land with a mix of sorrow and determination. The fields, once again, became places of work and hope, but the scars of loss ran deep. Many villages were smaller, their populations thinned by death. The old ways of life persisted, but they carried new complexities: a lingering fear of disease, shifting social roles as widows and orphans took on new responsibilities, and an awareness that the world was fragile and uncertain. The Black Plague did not merely take lives, it reshaped the very fabric of peasant existence, challenging their resilience and forcing adaptations that would echo through generations. As the shadow of the Black Plague began to lift, the slow and uncertain process of rebuilding peasant life unfolded amid a landscape forever changed by loss and upheaval. The survivors returned to villages where the familiar sights and sounds had been silenced by death, where fields once bustling with activity now lay fallow and overgrown, and where the faces of friends and family had been reduced to memories whispered in quiet moments. The task of restoring not only the land but also the community's spirit was daunting, yet it was one they faced with the stubborn resolve born of countless hardships endured before. Peasants who had lost loved ones grappled with grief that was as raw and persistent as the soil beneath their feet. Widows found themselves not only mourning husbands but stepping into roles as heads of households, managing farms and finances in ways few had anticipated. Children orphaned by the plague were taken in by relatives or neighbors, their futures uncertain but bound by the fragile safety nets of village life. The social fabric, frayed by death and fear, began to mend through acts of cooperation and necessity. Villagers shared what resources remained, pooled labor to restore fields, and leaned on one another for emotional support. Communal gatherings, once suspended, slowly returned, providing opportunities to honor the dead and celebrate the living. Festivals, church services, and market days resumed, offering glimpses of normalcy amid the lingering shadows of loss. Economically, the scarcity of labor empowered peasants in new ways. With fewer workers available, surviving peasants could negotiate better terms for their labor and land use. Some rented land directly from lords or even purchased small plots, a departure from the rigid feudal obligations that had long defined their lives. This shift began to chip away at the old social order, planting seeds for future change and greater personal autonomy. Yet, this period was also marked by uncertainty and fear. The plague's origins remained a mystery to most, and the possibility of its return haunted many. Villages erected quarantine measures, and some isolated themselves to avoid contact with outsiders. The Church's authority, shaken by its inability to prevent the catastrophe, faced challenges as people sought alternative spiritual paths or questioned long-held beliefs. Women's roles in society expanded during this time, as their contributions to farming, healing, and household management became vital to community survival. Some women became respected healers or midwives, drawing on traditional knowledge and adapting to new challenges posed by the plague's aftermath. The children who survived carried the trauma of loss, but also the lessons of resilience passed down by their elders. Education remained limited, but stories of survival, faith, and endurance were woven into the oral traditions that preserved the community's history and identity. The landscape itself bore the marks of the plague years. Fields that had lain fallow gave way to new patterns of cultivation, sometimes more diversified to reduce the risks of crop failure. Forests encroached on abandoned lands, and wildlife returned to areas once crowded with human activity. These changes reflected the deep and lasting impact of the plague on the environment as well as human society. The process of recovery was slow and uneven, marked by setbacks and ongoing challenges. Yet, through it all, the peasant communities demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to adapt and endure. Their lives, shaped by the harsh realities of the medieval world and the extraordinary trauma of the Black Plague, continued to unfold in a world where death and survival were intertwined, and where the future, though uncertain, was still theirs to shape. The Black Plague's devastation also had profound effects on the spiritual lives of peasants, reshaping their faith, rituals, and relationship with the divine in ways that would ripple through generations. Before the plague, the church was a cornerstone of daily life, a source of comfort, guidance, and community. Peasants gathered regularly for Mass, sought blessings for crops and families, and looked to their priests for answers to life's mysteries and hardships. The rhythms of the liturgical calendar, Easter, Christmas, saints' feast days, punctuated their lives like steady beacons in an often harsh and uncertain world. But as the plague tore through villages, the church's ability to provide solace was tested as never before. Clergy, who traditionally ministered to the sick and oversaw burial rites, were often among the first victims. In many villages, priests fled or died, leaving communities spiritually adrift. The sacred rituals that had offered hope, confession, last rites, funerals, became scarce or hurried, and the fear of contagion kept many from attending church altogether. This absence created a spiritual void that deepened the anguish of peasants already grappling with unimaginable loss. With the church's authority shaken, peasants turned to new and diverse expressions of faith and superstition. Some embraced flagellant movements, where groups of penitents would publicly scourge themselves, believing that their suffering might appease God's wrath and halt the plague. Others sought protection through relics, pilgrimages to holy sites, or the intercession of saints, hoping for miraculous salvation. Folk beliefs, charms, and rituals, rooted in older, pagan traditions, often mingled with Christian practices, reflecting a desperate grasp for control amid chaos. Fear and grief also gave rise to scapegoating and persecution. Accusations against minorities such as Jews, foreigners, or those deemed witches spread, fueled by rumors that these groups had poisoned wells or summoned the plague through dark magic. These tragic episodes of violence and injustice reveal how the terror of the plague fractured communities and eroded trust, even as peasants sought comfort in faith. Despite these trials, the Black Plague also inspired profound reflection on mortality and the meaning of life. Art, poetry, and oral stories began to explore themes of death's inevitability, the fleeting nature of earthly existence, and the hope for salvation beyond the grave. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, emerged as a powerful motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life, peasants and nobles alike, into the arms of death, underscoring the equality found in mortality. Over time, these cultural expressions shaped the way peasants and wider society understood life and death, blending sorrow, acceptance, and hope into a new spiritual landscape. The Church itself would eventually respond to these challenges by reforming practices and seeking to reassert its role in healing and guidance, but the scars left by the plague's spiritual crisis endured. Peasant faith after the Black Death was a tapestry of resilience, adaptation, and complexity, woven from threads of traditional belief, fear, hope, and a profound confrontation with the fragility of life. The psychological and emotional toll of the Black Plague on peasant communities was immense, weaving a complex web of grief, fear, and resilience that shaped the fabric of daily life in ways both seen and unseen. As the plague swept through villages like an unforgiving tempest, it left behind a landscape scarred not only by death but by the deep wounds of loss and trauma. Each household carried stories of vanished loved ones, parents, children, siblings, friends, creating an ever-growing void where laughter and comfort once lived. The pain of sudden loss was compounded by the relentless pace of death. In many villages, the steady succession of funerals blurred into one unending procession, with no time or space for mourning to unfold naturally. This pervasive sorrow was often accompanied by a profound sense of helplessness. Peasants, grounded in a world where they worked closely with nature and the rhythms of the earth, found themselves powerless against an invisible enemy. The black boils and fevers that marked the disease seemed capricious, striking without reason or mercy, shattering any hope of understanding or control. Such unpredictability bred a climate of fear that seeped into every corner of village life. People isolated themselves, reluctant to touch or comfort neighbors, wary of sharing food or water, and sometimes even turning against one another in suspicion and desperation. The social bonds that had once held communities together stretched thin, fraying under the weight of panic. Yet, amid this darkness, human resilience flickered quietly. Stories passed from parent to child, neighbors shared what they could, and rituals, however altered or rushed, continued to mark the passage of life and death. Prayer, song, and remembrance offered fragile lifelines to those navigating grief and uncertainty. Folklore and superstition evolved, providing explanations and coping mechanisms in a world turned upside down. The trauma of the plague also reshaped perceptions of mortality and existence. The ever-present dance of death, seen in art and oral tradition, reflected a newfound awareness of life's fragility and the shared fate that united rich and poor alike. This cultural shift brought both sobering acceptance and a deeper yearning for meaning and hope beyond the suffering. The psychological scars of the plague endured long after the last victim had passed, influencing how peasants lived, loved, and believed in the generations that followed. They shaped community structures, religious practices, and even approaches to health and medicine, leaving an imprint as lasting as the stones of the village churches that had witnessed so much sorrow. In this way, the Black Plague was not just a catastrophe of bodies, but a profound upheaval of the human spirit, challenging peasants to find strength amid despair, and to rebuild lives forever marked by loss but also by enduring hope. The plague's grip twisted everyday life into something almost unrecognizable, yet even in such dark times, the stubborn spark of humor flickered among peasants like a tiny, rebellious fire refusing to be snuffed out. Imagine a village where once the market square echoed with bartering cries and the clatter of hooves, now silent except for the occasional squeak of a lonely rat or the muffled cough of a wary peasant hiding behind a crooked fence. In those eerie silences, people found small ways to laugh, sometimes out of genuine amusement, often out of nervousness so thick you could cut it with a rusty sickle. One common tale told in hushed whispers and wry smiles was that of old Tom, the village fool, who insisted the plague was nothing more than a bad case of the summer sniffles, and attempted to cure himself by drinking copious amounts of nettle tea mixed with ale, resulting in more hiccups than healing. His antics, while medically useless, gave villagers something to chuckle about when the rest of the world felt like it was crumbling under the weight of death and despair. It was said that Tom's hiccups could be heard for miles, a sort of bizarre echo bouncing across the hills, reminding everyone that life still had a playful side even as it teetered on the edge of catastrophe. Peasant humor also found its way into everyday complaints, like how farmers joked that the rats seemed to be living better than anyone else, feasting on grain stores while humans barely had enough bread to toast. If only we could train them to pay rent, one villager was overheard grumbling, we'd all be a bit richer. Such jabs at misfortune became a way to cope, a subtle rebellion against the bleakness surrounding them. Children, in particular, showed remarkable resilience. Despite orphanhood and hardship, they managed to invent games that turned the gloom inside out, chasing each other around fields, pretending to be plague doctors with sticks and bits of cloth fashioned into masks, giggling at their own exaggerated coughs and dramatic treatment dances. Their laughter was a balm, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. These moments of levity were not just distractions, they were vital expressions of humanity, tiny sparks in a vast night. Even among the hardest tasks, digging graves, tending the sick, peasants found ways to exchange jokes or poke fun at their circumstances. When one weary farmer muttered that the plague seemed to have a personal vendetta against his family, his neighbor quipped back, "Well, at least it's consistent, it doesn't play favorites." Life in the shadow of the plague was brutal and unrelenting, but these glimpses of humor, these shared smiles and whispered jokes, wove a subtle thread of connection through the fear and sorrow. They reminded peasants that beneath the crushing weight of tragedy, the human spirit still danced, sometimes clumsily, sometimes wildly, but always defiantly. This laughter, fragile as the first green shoots pushing through winter's frozen earth, was a quiet yet powerful form of resistance, proof that even when the skies are darkest, the dawn is not beyond hope. As peasants navigated the harsh realities of life during and after the Black Plague, their relationship with the land, a bond as old as time itself, was tested in profound and unexpected ways. Before the plague, the soil was both a source of sustenance and a demanding master, requiring constant attention, skill, and sacrifice. The rhythms of sowing and harvesting dictated the pulse of village life like a slow, steady heartbeat. Yet after the plague's devastation, the land seemed to take on a strange new character, as if it too bore the weight of loss and change. With so many hands gone, fields that had once been meticulously tended were abandoned or neglected, allowing wild grasses and weeds to creep in like silent invaders reclaiming lost ground. Forests began to edge closer to villages, their shadows stretching longer over empty fields, and the natural world appeared to swell and shift in response to humanity's sudden absence. For peasants who survived, this change was both unsettling and full of possibility. Some saw the overgrown fields as a sign of nature's resilience, a reminder that life, in all its stubbornness, could persist even when everything seemed lost. Others felt a pang of sadness, mourning the once fertile lands now overrun with brambles and thistles, a visual echo of their own shattered communities. This relationship with the land was not just practical but deeply spiritual. Peasants believed that the earth held memories and spirits, that the soil was connected to ancestors and gods who watched over their toil. The disruption caused by the plague unsettled these beliefs, prompting new rituals and offerings meant to appease the restless forces believed to dwell within the land. Some villages held ceremonies to cleanse fields and ask for blessings to restore fertility, weaving prayers and offerings into the turning of the seasons. In the midst of these challenges, peasants adapted their farming practices to meet new realities. With fewer laborious, they shifted toward crops that required less intensive care or shorter growing seasons, experimenting with rotation and diversification to guard against failure. Tools and techniques evolved, sometimes incorporating innovations borrowed from neighboring regions or inspired by necessity. This adaptability was a quiet testament to human ingenuity under pressure, a survival instinct woven into the fabric of everyday life. Livestock, too, played a vital role in recovery. Animals provided not only food and labor but also a link to stability and continuity. Caring for cattle, sheep, and chickens offered a semblance of normalcy, and the routines of feeding and tending animals helped ground peasants in a world that often felt unmoored. The land's slow healing mirrored the people's own. Just as fields gradually yielded new crops and forests reclaimed abandoned clearings, peasant communities began to regrow, reknitting the bonds of family, labor, and faith that held them together. Though the scars of the plague remained, the relationship between peasants and the land endured, shaped by loss but also by the enduring cycle of life that promised renewal beyond the darkest nights. The passing seasons after the Black Plague became a strange mixture of hope and caution, where peasants learned to read the land with new eyes, their every action shadowed by memories of loss yet driven by the stubborn will to survive. Spring's arrival, which once burst forth like a joyful song, now carried a softer tone, a quiet promise rather than a bold proclamation. When the first shoots of green pushed through the thawing earth, peasants would gather, sometimes exchanging hopeful glances, silently acknowledging that life persisted despite everything. Planting seasons were no longer mere routines but acts of faith, where each seed cast into the soil carried not only the hope of a harvest but the weight of survival itself. The tools used bore the marks of hardship. Wooden plows, repaired with crude bindings, sometimes cracked under the strain, forcing peasants to innovate or rely on fewer oxen. The work was slower, yet it was done with a reverence born from understanding that the land was both friend and fragile ally. Fields were sometimes left fallow longer, allowing the soil to regain strength, a practice that reflected both necessity and an emerging awareness of sustainable stewardship, even if unspoken. Harvest time carried a bittersweet edge. The fruits of labor were precious beyond measure, yet the emptiness left by lost neighbors and family cast a shadow over the festivities. Where once communal gatherings spilled laughter and song into the long summer evenings, now the celebrations were quieter, tinged with remembrance. Elders shared stories of better days and lessons learned, weaving memories into the fabric of the community's future. Throughout these cycles, nature itself seemed to respond to the shifts in human activity. Wildlife, emboldened by abandoned fields and quieter villages, ventured closer, their presence a reminder that the world was vast and full of life beyond human toil. Birds nested in forgotten barns, deer grazed near once busy paths, and the occasional fox darted through the shadows like a fleeting secret. This subtle return of wildness was both a comfort and a challenge, as peasants had to balance the benefits of nature's gifts with the threats posed to crops and livestock. The seasons also influenced the rhythms of peasant spirituality. Festivals tied to solstices, equinoxes, and harvests took on layered meanings, blending Christian rites with older, earth-centered customs that honored the cycles of growth and decay. These celebrations, though subdued, reinforced community bonds and offered moments of joy and reflection amid the ongoing struggle. Through the changing seasons, peasants navigated a world forever altered by the plague, their lives a testament to resilience and adaptation. The land and its people, intertwined like roots beneath the surface, continued their slow dance of renewal, carrying forward a fragile hope that even after the darkest winters, spring's light would return once more. The stories and songs of peasants during the Black Plague years carried a strange blend of sorrow, humor, and resilience, oral traditions that wove the harsh realities of their lives into tales that could comfort, teach, and sometimes even provoke laughter in the face of despair. Storytelling around the hearth was a sacred ritual, a way to pass time when fields lay fallow and the world outside seemed shrouded in fear. Mothers and grandmothers spun tales of clever tricksters and mischievous spirits, weaving lessons of caution and hope into their words. One popular story was of a crafty fox who outwitted death himself, slipping away at the last moment by distracting him with riddles and jokes, a reminder that even the inevitable could be faced with wit and courage. These tales were more than entertainment. They were lifelines connecting past, present, and future, reminding listeners that survival required both strength and a nimble mind. Songs, too, took on new meanings. Work songs, once simply tools to synchronize labor, became expressions of shared endurance, their refrains echoing the rhythms of planting and harvest even when few hands were left to till the soil. Lamentations, sung in haunting melodies, mourned the losses of loved ones while also invoking blessings for those still living. In darker moments, peasants composed bawdy ditties poking fun at the folly of nobles and priests, their humor a subtle form of rebellion and a way to reclaim a sense of agency amid chaos. Festivals and communal gatherings, when they occurred, were occasions for storytelling contests, where the most imaginative and spirited tales were celebrated. These events fostered community spirit, reinforcing bonds frayed by fear and death. Children learned to carry on these traditions, ensuring that the lessons and laughter survived the generations. The oral culture of peasants during the plague years was a rich tapestry, woven from threads of grief and joy, superstition and faith, fear and defiance. It captured the complexities of human experience in a time when the world seemed turned upside down, offering comfort and connection in the face of overwhelming loss. Through stories and songs, peasants found ways to make sense of their suffering, to hold on to hope, and to celebrate the stubborn, irrepressible spirit of life itself. The medical knowledge of peasants during the Black Plague was a curious mixture of folk wisdom, superstition, and desperate improvisation, a patchwork quilt of beliefs and practices passed down through generations and adapted to the grim realities of the time. Before the plague, healing was often a family affair, with knowledge of herbs and remedies handed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, a treasure trove of cures and poultices rooted in close observation of nature's bounty. When the plague struck, formal medicine was woefully inadequate, and trained physicians were few and far between, often fleeing the infected or falling victim themselves. This left peasants to rely heavily on their own skills and the advice of local healers, sometimes wise women or village elders whose knowledge straddled the line between accepted practice and forbidden magic. Herbs such as sage, rosemary, and lavender were boiled into smelly concoctions believed to purify the air or ward off evil spirits thought to carry disease. People carried posies of flowers or burned incense in their homes, hoping to cleanse their surroundings. Some even resorted to wearing amulets or charms inscribed with prayers, their faith a shield against the invisible threat. Treatment for the sick was a delicate and often heartbreaking task. Families tried poultices made of onions, vinegar, or even crushed snakeskin, applied to the swollen buboes that were the plague's hallmark. These remedies, though lacking any real efficacy against the disease, provided a sense of agency in a world otherwise ruled by helplessness. Amid these efforts, some peasants held fast to ritual and prayer, believing that divine intervention could still save lives. Others, desperate and frightened, tried more desperate measures, bleeding, purging, or even drinking mixtures of dubious origin, actions born from a hope so fierce it defied logic. The role of the healer was fraught with danger and suspicion. Those who tended the sick risked contagion and ostracization, yet their work was essential. In the heart of medieval Europe, where the rhythms of daily life were once as steady and predictable as the turning of the seasons, the arrival of the Black Plague shattered the world of peasants with a force as sudden and fierce as a summer storm bursting through a calm sky. Picture a village nestled among rolling hills, its thatched cottages clustered close like a family huddled against the cold, the scent of wood smoke mingling with fresh earth and livestock. Before the plague, this village hummed with activity. Children's laughter echoing between stone walls, women bent over looms weaving cloth, men guiding oxen through ploughed fields, and the bell from the village church marking the passage of time with comforting regularity. The social fabric was tightly woven. Every person had a role, a place, a purpose within the great wheel of feudal life, where survival depended on community and the land's bounty. But then, as if whispered on the wind from far-off lands, the plague arrived, carried by rats and fleas, by travelers and traders, slipping silently into homes like a thief in the night. At first, its presence was a shadow, a rumor spoken in hushed voices as neighbors fell ill with fevers and swellings that seemed to burst from the skin like black grapes left to rot. The disease spread faster than any illness the peasants had known, indifferent to age, rank, or piety. The panic was palpable, like a rising tide swallowing all in its path. Families barricaded doors, village elders warned of divine punishment, and the church called for prayer and repentance, yet none could stem the invisible tide. Days turned into nights filled with coughing fits and desperate prayers, while the sick writhed in agony, and the healthy trembled in fear. The usual rhythms of work and worship fell away, replaced by the grim tasks of tending the ill and burying the dead. In those dark times, daily life became a relentless struggle against despair. Food grew scarce as fields lay untended, the sick too weak to work, and markets closed under the weight of death and dread. Hunger gnawed alongside sickness, a cruel double-edged sword. The village well, once a gathering place for gossip and laughter, became a place of fear, as even water was suspected of carrying death. Superstition flourished like weeds in fallow fields. Some believed that the plague was sent by angry saints, others whispered that witches or heretics had cursed the land. Fear bred suspicion and isolation. Neighbors avoided one another, afraid to share food or touch the sick. The concept of community was stretched to breaking point. Yet, amid the terror, the human spirit clung stubbornly to life and hope. Some peasants risked their own safety to care for the dying, washing fevered brows with trembling hands, sharing the last scraps of bread, and whispering prayers for mercy. Others fled to remote forests or hills, seeking refuge from the invisible killer, carrying with them stories of survival and loss. Children, often orphaned and frightened, found solace in small acts of play and laughter, their games sometimes mocking the grim realities with a cheeky defiance that echoed through empty streets. Peasant humor, dark and sharp, became a coping mechanism. Jokes about rats feasting better than humans, or about old Tom's notorious hiccups after his failed herbal remedies, spread from whispered conversations to raucous bursts of laughter around hearth fires. These small moments of levity were precious, fragile shields against the overwhelming shadow of death. Social structures began to shift as death thinned populations. Labor became scarce, and those who survived found themselves with newfound leverage to demand better treatment or wages. Widows and women, having taken on roles previously held by men, gained respect and responsibility, their contributions essential to the village's survival. Children who had lost parents were adopted into new families or struggled to carve out existence on their own. The land itself seemed to grieve with its people. Fields once bursting with grain fell to weeds and brambles, forests crept back into abandoned spaces, and wild animals roamed closer to human settlements. The seasons passed in a blur of survival, spring's hope tempered by the shadow of past loss, summer's warmth a reminder of life's persistence, autumn's harvest bittersweet, and winter's chill a harsh test of endurance. The plague was more than a disease. It was a force that rewrote the story of peasant life, etching grief and resilience into every stone and stalk. Through suffering and adaptation, laughter and tears, peasants forged a new world from the ashes, their lives a testament to the indomitable human will to endure, rebuild, and hope amid the darkest of nights. The aftermath of the Black Plague was like waking from a nightmare into a world forever altered, one where the familiar landmarks of village life stood distorted, shadows stretched longer, and the once clear paths of tradition became tangled with uncertainty. For peasants, each day was a balancing act between the lingering echoes of grief and the pressing demands of survival. The sheer scale of loss was staggering. families fragmented, friendships severed, entire generations vanished, leaving behind a hollow silence where the chorus of voices had once risen in unison. Yet life did not pause. The earth did not wait for sorrow to pass. Fields needed tilling, animals required feeding, and the fragile networks of trade and barter had to be rekindled, no matter how heavy the heart or tired the body. The social order, once rigid and unquestioned, began to creak and groan under the weight of change. Lords and nobles, facing empty fields and dwindling labor pools, found themselves negotiating with peasants who now, for the first time in centuries, held some measure of power. Wages rose, rents were contested, and the bonds of serfdom loosened like old ropes frayed by strain. Peasants learned to wield their scarcity as leverage, bargaining for freedoms that once seemed unimaginable. In this shifting landscape, women emerged as pivotal actors. Widowed by the plague's indiscriminate hand, many took control of farms, managed resources, and navigated legal complexities with a determination forged in hardship. Their roles extended beyond the domestic sphere, encompassing leadership, trade, and even healing. Midwives and wise women, drawing on generations of knowledge, became essential caretakers in communities where official medical aid was scarce or mistrusted. The healing arts themselves were a complex tapestry of herbal remedies, prayers, and folk practices, a blend of hope, tradition, and the occasional wild guess. The land bore the scars of absence and neglect, yet also whispered of renewal. Overgrown fields, once the pride of villages, were reclaimed by brambles and wildflowers, while forests crept forward like patient sentinels guarding forgotten ground. Wildlife flourished in these quieter spaces, and peasants had to navigate new challenges and opportunities as the natural world responded to humanity's retreat. Throughout these transformations, faith remained a lodestar, though often questioned and reshaped. The Church, battered by the plague's toll and the loss of clergy, struggled to reassert its role, while new religious movements and folk beliefs took root, reflecting the deep spiritual searching of a people scarred by catastrophe. Rituals and festivals, though muted and sometimes altered, persisted as vital threads of community and continuity, offering moments of shared hope and remembrance. Children, born into this changed world, grew up with stories of loss and survival woven into their very identities. Orphaned or displaced, they learned early the harsh lessons of resilience, yet also the power of play, laughter, and imagination to heal invisible wounds. The psychological landscape was complex, marked by grief and trauma but also by adaptability and quiet courage. Life after the plague was not simply a return to the old ways but a rebirth into something new and uncertain. Peasant communities, though battered and diminished, carried forward traditions and values while embracing change. Their stories are testament to the enduring human capacity to endure and transform in the face of unimaginable adversity. The daily routines of peasants after the Black Plague had a new rhythm, one that was fragile and cautious, yet filled with determined effort to rebuild life piece by piece. Dawn often broke with a thin, pale light filtering through ragged curtains, waking those who remained to the heavy tasks ahead. Men and women, though fewer in number, rose early to tend the fields, their hands rough and calloused from years of toil, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air as they whispered plans for planting or repairing fences. The scarcity of labor meant that every task carried extra weight. Plowing a field once done by a handful now required double the effort, forcing neighbors to band together for communal work, sharing tools and muscle in a way that sometimes sparked grudges and sometimes forged new bonds. The village well, once a bustling hub of chatter and gossip, was now approached with wary steps. Water was treasured as much for life as it was feared for carrying unseen death. Women carried heavy buckets balanced precariously on their hips, their conversations guarded but tinged with a persistent humor that refused to be extinguished. Among the women, stories of old Tom's infamous hiccups or the way Widow Marla's chickens seemed to mock the village by laying eggs in the most inconvenient spots sparked bursts of laughter, small rebellions against the grim backdrop of their days. Meals were simpler and scarcer. Bread was baked sparingly, often coarse and hard, accompanied by whatever vegetables the soil could coax forth or the livestock could provide. Preservation of food was a skill honed out of necessity. Herbs were dried and stored, salted pork rationed carefully, and every crumb counted. Children, now orphans or burdened with extra chores, often scavenged for wild berries or snared rabbits, their small hands learning early the delicate art of survival. The church bell, though less frequently heard, still marked the passing of hours and called the faithful to prayer, but services were smaller, quieter, and sometimes held outdoors to reduce fear of contagion. Priests, fewer and stretched thin, moved between villages like shadows, their voices heavy with sorrow but unwavering in hope. Markets, once vibrant and noisy, reopened slowly, with traders wary and goods limited. Peasants bartered with what little they had, eggs for cloth, milk for grain, crafting fragile economies that kept villages tethered to one another. Occasionally, travelers brought news from distant towns, stories of noble struggles, or whispered rumors of better times ahead. The natural world seemed to reflect the precariousness of human life. Birds nested in abandoned barns, their songs a bittersweet soundtrack to the empty lanes. Foxes and deer moved cautiously closer to the edges of villages, sensing the thinning of human presence. The seasons dictated survival, and each change brought new challenges. Spring rains that threatened to wash away seeds sown with such hope, summer droughts that parched the earth and tested resilience, autumn chills that warned of winter's grip looming close. The peasant's calendar was no longer just a measure of time but a ledger of hopes and fears, each day a thread in a fragile tapestry of life rebuilding itself. The way peasants cared for their families during and after the Black Plague carried both the weight of necessity and the delicate tenderness born of shared hardship. Mothers, often widowed or left without support, became the steadfast centers of their households, balancing the fierce demands of survival with moments of quiet love and teaching. Their hands, rough from endless labor, could soothe fevered brows just as skillfully as they prepared meager meals or repaired worn clothing. Children clung to these women as anchors in a turbulent world, learning the unspoken lessons of resilience through shared smiles and whispered stories by flickering candlelight. Amidst the daily struggles, humor persisted as a balm. There were tales told of little Jory, a mischievous boy who, despite the gloom, managed to sneak into the grain stores and abscond with handfuls of corn, only to be caught and scolded by the village elder with a laugh and a shake of the head. His antics reminded the weary villagers that laughter could still bloom, even in the hardest soil. Family bonds were stretched thin as the plague claimed parents and grandparents, but extended kin and neighbors often stepped in, creating informal networks of care. Children orphaned by the disease were adopted or fostered by relatives or village families, their survival dependent on these fragile webs of human kindness. Apprenticeships in crafts or farming became vital not only for economic reasons but as social anchors, giving young people purpose and connection. Daily chores, once shared widely among family members, became burdens heavier than ever. Women carried water, tended fires, cared for animals, and mended clothes, while men, when present, faced the relentless demands of the fields and repairing property damaged by neglect or storms. Despite exhaustion, there was a rhythm to these tasks that anchored villagers, a way to impose order and meaning on a world that often seemed chaotic and cruel. Religious faith remained intertwined with family life. Prayers were whispered over the sick, blessings sought before planting or eating, and small shrines maintained in humble homes. The presence of the church was felt even when physical attendance was risky or impossible. Symbols of protection, crosses, holy water, charms, were kept close, blending Christian belief with folk traditions passed down through generations. The care of the elderly became a poignant aspect of peasant life during this era. Those spared by the plague, though often frail, held treasured wisdom and memories of times before catastrophe. Their stories and guidance provided a link to a past slipping into myth and a beacon for a future uncertain. The village gathered around them in moments of reverence and respect, honoring the endurance of those who carried the scars of loss yet remained pillars of their communities. In all these ways, family life, though altered and battered, became a source of strength and continuity. The tender acts of care, the stolen moments of laughter, and the shared burdens forged connections that sustained peasants through the darkest days and into the fragile light of recovery. As the shadow of the Black Plague began to lift, peasants faced the daunting task of rebuilding a world that had been torn apart by death and despair. The first signs of recovery were subtle: a single field cleared of brambles, a repaired fence standing against the wind, a child's laughter echoing where silence had reigned. With so many hands lost, those who remained had to stretch themselves thin, balancing mourning with the urgent need to restore homes, cultivate the earth, and repair the fragile bonds of community. Land that had lain fallow was coaxed back to life with patient care. Peasants learned to work smarter, not just harder, experimenting with crop rotations and sharing knowledge about which seeds thrived best in the changed soil. They traded and bartered tools, seeds, and livestock, creating new networks of support that sometimes spanned beyond their immediate villages. Labor shortages forced a shift in social dynamics. Peasants who had once been bound tightly to the land found new leverage in negotiating rents and obligations, slowly altering centuries-old feudal relationships. Women, having managed households and farms during the worst years, continued to assert their roles as essential leaders in both the economy and family life. Villages that survived banded together more closely, pooling resources to repair common structures like mills, wells, and communal ovens. Feasts and festivals, once muted, began to take on renewed importance as occasions not only for celebration but for healing, a chance to remember those lost and to welcome new generations. The rebuilding was slow and uneven. Some villages struggled against poverty and lingering fear, while others found surprising vitality, adapting to the changed world with creativity and determination. The land itself bore the scars of neglect, but also showed its resilience. Wildflowers bloomed in once cultivated fields, birds returned to silent trees, and the cycle of seasons resumed its ancient dance. Through it all, the survivors carried the memory of the plague like a shadow in their hearts, a reminder of mortality but also a call to cherish life's fragile beauty. The process of rebuilding was not just physical but deeply social and emotional, weaving together threads of hope, memory, and new possibility into the fabric of everyday existence. The efforts to rebuild after the Black Plague often began with the most basic, yet essential, tasks: repairing homes battered by storms or neglect, mending thatched roofs and patching wooden walls with whatever materials could be salvaged or scavenged. Families who had lost loved ones clung to these acts of restoration as a way to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Each repaired beam, each freshly plastered wall was more than a physical fix. It was a declaration that life would continue despite the scars left behind. The rebuilding of homes required community cooperation. Neighbors came together to lend tools, share skills, and offer labor, forming temporary alliances that sometimes blossomed into lasting friendships. This spirit of mutual aid was a lifeline, turning the tedious and exhausting work into moments of shared purpose and, occasionally, humor, like when two men accidentally knocked over a freshly plastered wall or when a stray goat caused chaos by nibbling on a pile of stored straw. The restoration of infrastructure extended beyond individual homes. Villages pooled resources to repair communal ovens, wells, and granaries, structures vital to survival that had fallen into disrepair during the plague's darkest days. Wells, especially, were critical. Clean water was a precious commodity, and ensuring its availability required not only physical repair but also careful guarding against contamination. Sometimes, old wells that had been abandoned or forgotten were rediscovered and brought back into service, their clear waters a symbol of renewal. Farming practices adapted to the new realities. With fewer hands to tend the land, peasants prioritized crops that were hardy and less labor-intensive, such as barley, rye, and certain vegetables. Crop rotation became more widely practiced as a way to preserve soil fertility, and fallow fields were carefully monitored to balance rest and productivity. Livestock, too, played a crucial role. Animals provided not just food but also labor and fertilizer, linking animal husbandry closely with crop cultivation. The scarcity of labor meant that communal workdays became a fixture of village life. Tasks that once might have been done individually were now undertaken by groups who shared the burden. These gatherings, while necessary, also served as rare social occasions, where news was exchanged, alliances formed, and spirits lifted by storytelling or song. At times, the exhaustion and stress of rebuilding sparked tensions and disputes over land boundaries, resource use, or perceived inequities, but these were often mediated through village elders or local custom, preserving fragile peace. Religion and faith remained central to rebuilding efforts. Villagers organized collective prayers and processions seeking divine favor for bountiful harvests and protection against future calamities. Churches, often damaged or neglected during the plague years, became focal points for community renewal, their walls echoing once more with hymns and gatherings. The restoration of religious life helped knit the social fabric, offering comfort and a shared sense of purpose. Children, too, were part of the rebuilding, growing, learning, and taking on responsibilities that shaped the next generation of villagers. Apprenticeships in crafts like weaving, blacksmithing, and carpentry resumed, ensuring that vital skills were passed down even as the older generation faded. Play and laughter returned to village lanes, a quiet but potent sign that life's rhythms were regaining their cadence. In these ways, the slow, laborious process of rebuilding after the Black Plague unfolded, marked by effort, cooperation, setbacks, and small triumphs, setting the stage for a transformed peasant life that would carry echoes of loss but also glimmers of renewal. Fields that had lain fallow during the darkest years of the plague slowly returned to the rhythms of planting and harvest. Each furrow turned a testament to human perseverance. Peasants, now few but fiercely determined, learned to work the land with new wisdom born from necessity. Crop choices reflected the harsh realities of labor shortages. Grains like barley and rye, less demanding than wheat, became staples, while legumes such as peas and beans helped replenish the soil's nutrients in a practice that echoed ancient knowledge rediscovered. The cycle of seasons dictated life with renewed urgency, spring's tentative green shoots promising sustenance, summer's warmth hastening growth, autumn's bounty offering hope, and winter's chill demanding preparation and resilience. Livestock were treasured assets, providing milk, meat, and labor, and their care often required as much attention as the fields themselves. Oxen pulled heavy plows, their slow strength indispensable, while chickens and goats supplied eggs and dairy, small comforts amid scarcity. The interdependence of animal and human labor created a delicate balance, one that required careful stewardship and cooperation among villagers. Communal efforts extended beyond planting and harvesting. Peasants organized cooperative workdays known as beating the bounds or gleaning, where neighbors joined to gather crops from each other's fields, repair fences, or prepare storage facilities. These gatherings were both practical and social, blending hard work with storytelling, music, and shared meals when possible. The exchange of knowledge and resources during these times strengthened community ties, fostering a resilience that helped weather both natural hardships and human conflicts. Tools were precious and often handmade or repaired repeatedly to extend their use. Blacksmiths, vital members of the village, worked tirelessly to maintain plows, hoes, and sickles, their forge fires glowing like beacons in the twilight. The rhythm of the forge and field intertwined, symbolizing the symbiotic relationship between human skill and the earth's generosity. The rebuilding of irrigation channels and drainage ditches was another critical task. Water management determined the success or failure of crops, especially in regions prone to drought or flooding. Peasants used knowledge passed down from ancestors, combined with innovations learned through experience and necessity, to guide water where it was needed and protect fields from destructive overflow. These practical skills, often shared orally and demonstrated through hands-on teaching, were essential for survival. That is the story of peasants living through the Black Plague. Thank you and good night.